So, this self-appointed neighborhood queen literally boots my front door off its hinges right while I'm pouring a glass of vintage bourbon for the regional director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. She didn't just trespass, she committed 5 different felonies in front of the one person in the country who could bury her in a federal cell for the next 20 years. I'm talking about splintered oak, expensive loafers crunching on the doorframe, and a cloud of perfume so thick it probably violated the Clean Air Act. This woman, draped in a $2,000 silk wrap, stormed into my family's mountain lodge screaming about zoning codes and peasant aesthetics. She had zero clue she was crashing a private meeting of the highest order. Even better, she was recording the whole thing for her 4,000 social media followers, effectively filming her own one-way ticket to the big house. 6 months ago, I thought Beatrice was just your run-of-the-mill control freak. I didn't realize she was actually the architect of a $5 million land grab scheme, and I was about to accidentally pull the thread that unraveled her entire criminal empire. My name is Silas Thorne. I'm 55 years old. After 30 years of inspecting deep-sea oil rigs in the North Sea, cold, lonely work that pays well if you don't mind the danger, I finally cashed out. My prize? My grandfather's apple orchard on High Crest Ridge. 10 acres of heaven that old man Thorne bought back in 1947 for exactly $900. Can you believe that? $900 for a ridge-top view that's now worth more than a fleet of private jets. This wasn't some cookie-cutter mansion. It was a house built from fieldstone and cedar, with a fireplace that could fit a grown man and a porch that looked out over the entire valley. I kept it rugged. Solar arrays on the barn, well water that tasted like liquid diamonds, and a perimeter fence I built myself. My grandfather used to say, "Silas, if a fox keeps circling the coop, he isn't interested in the chickens looking for a way to steal the whole farm." Then came Beatrice Sterling. She rolled into our quiet mountain community like a storm front in a silver Range Rover. She was 60 and acted like she'd been elected Empress of the world. Her license plate actually said number 1. She was the head of the Ridge Heritage Council, a fancy name for a group of busybodies who wanted to turn our rugged mountain into a gated playground for billionaires. Within 3 months of her arrival, 4 of my oldest neighbors, people who had lived here for 3 decades, suddenly packed up and sold their land for pennies on the dollar. It felt wrong. The first shot in her war was fired on a Thursday. I was on the porch, watching the hawk circle the valley, when I heard the clack 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 of designer heels on my gravel drive. At 6 in the morning. 10 minutes later, a bright orange sticker was slapped on my gate. Citation notice: non-compliant agricultural structures. Unsanitary water collection systems. Penalty, $700. Compliance required in 48 hours. I read it 3 times. My non-compliant structure was a 70-year-old barn. My unsanitary water was a state-of-the-art filtration system. I tried to be the bigger person. I met her in my driveway and explained that my property was protected by historic land use laws. She just smirked, adjusted her sunglasses, and said, "Every acre on this ridge belongs to my vision now, Silas. Ask the Miller family how history worked out for them." The Millers. My neighbors who had decided to move only 2 weeks ago. Something cold settled in my chest. Beatrice started walking my perimeter, taking photos of my solar panels and the hand-carved beams of my porch. By the end of the month, I had 12 more citations. The fines totaled over $10,000. She was trying to bleed me dry to force a foreclosure. But what she didn't know was that I wasn't just a retired inspector. I was a man who knew how to find the fracture points in any structure. 10 days after my deadline passed, a courier delivered a heavy envelope. It wasn't from the council, it was from a high-priced law firm in the city. A cease and desist order claiming my orchard was an environmental hazard to the local watershed. They were threatening to put a lien on the property within 15 days if I didn't pay $20,000 in remediation fees. My grandfather's voice echoed in my head, "When they use big words to steal your dirt, go look at the original deeds." I spent the next 48 hours in the county records office, and what I found wasn't just a zoning dispute. It was a trail of forged signatures, shell companies, and a $5 million embezzlement trail that led directly to Beatrice's designer handbag. She thought she was playing a game of chess against a checkers player. She didn't realize I had invited the most powerful prosecutor in the region over for a friendly chat to hand over the evidence. And that's exactly when she decided to kick my door down. I headed down to the county records office, a cramped, low-ceilinged basement where the real history of the world sits under 3 inches of dust and the hum of flickering fluorescent lights. The clerk, a kind woman named Mrs. Gable who used to buy apples from my grandfather's orchard every autumn, helped me haul out the original land surveys. I'd learned a vital lesson during my years on the oil rigs: never trust the man in the expensive suit until you've read the blueprints he's standing on. What I found in those yellowed pages made my jaw tighten. My grandfather's deed, stamped and notarized back in 1947, was a masterpiece of foresight. It didn't just cover the 10 acres of trees, it included a 60-foot historical easement that extended right through what Beatrice now claimed was council-managed parkland. That eyesore stone wall she wanted me to tear down. It was actually the legal boundary marker for the entire ridge. But the real, smoking gun was the date. The Ridge Heritage Council wasn't even a legal entity until 2002, a full 55 years after my family had already secured the rights to this dirt. My old rig foreman used to say that an old deed is like a ghost, it doesn't care about your new laws, it just haunts whoever tries to build on top of it. I walked back to my truck feeling like I just found an extra 10,000 volts of leverage. That feeling lasted until I reached my driveway and found Beatrice's silver Range Rover parked sideways across the entrance. She wasn't even hiding it, she was blocking me in like she was a one-woman border patrol. When I tapped on her tinted glass, she lowered it just an inch, her eyes hidden behind designer frames. "Oh, Silas," she sighed, her voice dripping with artificial pity. "I'm just performing a mandatory survey of the community's shared access points. This could take 3 or 4 hours. You should really learn to be more patient." The low growl of her engine and that suffocating cloud of her perfume created a bubble of pure, concentrated arrogance. Here I was, a man who had survived North Sea storms and 500-foot dives, being held prisoner on my own land by a woman who probably hadn't even mowed her own lawn in 20 years. But Beatrice was just setting the stage for her great offensive. Within 1 week, she'd formed something called the Ridge Aesthetic Task Force. It sounded like a gardening club, but it functioned like a paramilitary unit. Neighbors who used to bring me jars of honey were suddenly crossing the road when they saw my truck. Her social media pages became a digital firing squad, filled with posts about protecting our legacy from negligent landowners. She even started a hashtag #CleanUpTheRidge. The comments were a bloodbath. People I'd known for 15 years were suddenly calling me a property value terrorist. A few neighbors actually pulled me aside under the cover of darkness. The Wilsons, a young couple from down the road, whispered to me over my back fence that Beatrice had threatened to audit their home addition if they didn't join her little crusade. "She's got her hooks in everyone," Silas, Mark Wilson whispered. "Her husband is a high-ranking consultant for the state senate. One phone call from him and our building permits just disappear." That hit me like a bucket of ice water. This wasn't just a neighborhood spat, it was a political squeeze. That night, someone took a can of crimson spray paint to my vintage barn. 4-foot-high letters screamed, "Comply or sell." My hidden security cameras, powered by a small solar cell in the tree line, caught the whole thing, including the license plate of the car that dropped off the vandals at 3 in the morning. When I called the local precinct, guess who rolled up? Officer Miller, Beatrice's own cousin. He didn't even get out of his cruiser to look at the paint. "Probably just some bored teenagers from the city, Silas," he said with a dismissive wave. "Not much we can do without a confession." The grit of that paint under my fingernails felt like a personal insult to my grandfather's memory. Old man Thorne used to say, "When the local law is in the pocket of the thief, you don't call the police, you call the owner of the pocket." It was time to find a bigger gun. Beatrice's next move was a masterpiece of bureaucratic warfare. She realized she couldn't break me with fines, so she decided to bury me in paperwork. It started with a knock from the county building inspector, a guy named Dave I'd actually worked with on a bridge project 10 years ago. The look of pure embarrassment on his face said everything. "I'm sorry, Silas," he muttered, clutching his clipboard. "I got an anonymous tip about structural instability in your main lodge. I have to do a full walkthrough." For the next 5 hours, Dave poked and prodded every beam. His final report. The house was built better than anything the modern contractors were putting up in the valley. But the inspection parade didn't stop there. The following day, a woman from the Environmental Protection Bureau showed up to investigate a report of my irrigation system leaking toxins into the mountain spring. 2 days after that, the fire marshal was at my door to inspect my solar battery storage for imminent fire hazards. Each inspection cost me a day of my life and a piece of my sanity. Each report came back clean, but on paper, it looked like my property was under constant investigation. It's an old corporate trick: make the target look troubled, so when you finally move in for the kill, nobody questions it. While I was drowning in inspectors, Beatrice was busy playing the media. She'd managed to get herself a 5-minute slot on the evening news, standing in front of my orchard gate and talking about the tragedy of decaying heritage and the need for stronger council oversight. She was turning the entire county against me, one soundbite at a time. She thought she was winning because she had the news cameras and the local cops. She forgot one thing: I had the paper trail. And I was about to invite a very important guest over for a drink someone Beatrice couldn't intimidate with a parking citation. That news segment was a masterclass in dishonest editing. Beatrice had clearly directed the cameraman to use specific angles that made my sturdy mountain lodge look like a decaying shack from a horror movie. She prattled on about structural hazards and threats to the safety of visiting children, posing as a noble protector of the public good while targeting a man who just wanted to grow his apples in peace. What truly sent my blood pressure into the stratosphere was watching her stand right on my grandfather's hand-carved stone, overlook the very structure she claimed was a dangerous violation, while she delivered her concerned citizen monologue for the lens. The persistent ping of my phone was like a hail of gunfire, text after text from people in the valley who'd seen the broadcast. By the time the sun went down, half of the mountain community believed I was some sort of unhinged environmental threat. But that was where Beatrice made her first one fatal mistake. She got arrogant. My old friend Elias, a retired foreman from my days on the deep-sea rigs, called me up an hour after the news aired. "Silas, that woman is selling a load of garbage and everyone with a brain knows it. You're the man who certified the structural integrity of 3 major oil platforms. I've seen you weld in a hurricane. That lodge of yours is probably the safest building in the 3 surrounding counties." Within 2 days, Elias had organized a convoy of experts. 20 of my former colleagues, men with degrees in structural engineering and decades of safety inspection experience, drove their trucks up the ridge to publicly examine my property. Turns out, having 20 world-class engineers publicly sign off on your dilapidated shack tends to deflate the hazardous building narrative pretty quickly. That was when the real game began. My old schoolmate, Julian Vance, now a high-powered defense attorney, stopped by with a bottle of aged scotch and a piece of information that made my hair stand on end. "You know, Silas," Julian said, leaning against the porch railing, "the State Bureau of Investigation has been quietly looking into Heritage Council racketeering across the region. We're seeing a very specific pattern of harassment." "What kind of pattern?" I asked, though the answer was already clicking into place like the tumblers of a lock. "They target legacy landowners, mostly seniors," Julian explained. "They bury them in fake fines and lawsuits until the property value hits rock bottom. Then, a shell company swoops in with a generous cash offer to save the owner from their debt. A year later, that land is sold to luxury developers for 10 times the price. The Bureau is looking for a whistleblower, someone who has a paper trail and the guts to stand up to the pressure. Someone like you." The quiet hum of the mountain night felt heavy with the weight of that realization. Beatrice wasn't just a neighborhood bully. She was the cleanup crew for a $5 million land flipping syndicate. That night, I opened a fresh ledger. I documented every fine, every trespassing incident, and every bogus inspection. I also did some digging into Beatrice's better half. It turned out her husband, Arthur Sterling, wasn't just a consultant. He was the state's political treasurer, a man who held the keys to zoning board appointments and infrastructure grants across 4 different districts. The scent of the mountain pines usually brought me peace, but now it only reminded me of what was at stake. This wasn't just about my grandfather's orchard anymore, it was about stopping a machine that was eating our community alive. Beatrice's response to my expert inspection was a total shift into character assassination. She decided that if she couldn't break my house, she'd break my name. It started with a post on the Ridge Watch social media group that made my stomach churn. Urgent, concerns regarding the aggressive and unstable behavior of a resident on High Crest Ridge. We advise all families to keep their children away from the Thorne Orchard for the time being. We are pursuing legal protections for our volunteers. #SafeRidge #ProtectOurKids. Aggressive behavior. Me. The man who had hosted the community's Young Explorers hike for 15 years. Within 6 hours, that post had been shared 43 times. The comments were a digital lynch mob. People I had known for decades were suddenly recalling times I had looked angry or unstable. I always knew something was off with him, one comment read. Thank heaven Beatrice is brave enough to speak up. The truly sinister part. Half of those accounts used generic stock photos for their profile pictures. It was a bot farm, a professional smear campaign orchestrated to make it look like the entire county hated me. 2 days later, she filed for a temporary restraining order. The legal petition, which was immediately leaked to the local papers, painted me as a violent hermit who had made verbal threats of physical harm against council members. It was a total fabrication, but in the court of public opinion, the filing was as good as a conviction. Judge Henderson, who had actually gone to school with my father, saw through the thin evidence and dismissed the order for lack of credible documentation. But the stain remained. Now, there was a public record with my name and the word threats on the same page. The emotional weight was starting to crush me. I'd sit in my grandfather's old leather chair, nursing a drink and wondering if it was worth it. Was 30 years of hard-earned retirement supposed to be spent fighting a ghost in a designer suit? Was the legacy of this land worth my sanity? But just as I was reaching my breaking point, the mountain started to fight back. Judge Henderson wasn't the only one who remembered the Thorne family. A retired magistrate named William "Big Bill" Carter, who had hunted on this ridge in the 70s, showed up at my door with a thermos of coffee and a look of grim determination. Silas, Bill said, that woman is playing a psychological game that your grandfather would have laughed at. She wants you to feel isolated. She wants you to feel like the world has turned against you so you'll just sign the papers and go away. Don't give her the win. Bill explained that this kind of systematic harassment usually meant the criminals were getting desperate. They needed the land now because their debts were piling up. Then, the local Mountain Veterans League, where I'd been a member for 20 years, issued a public statement calling the accusations baseless attacks on a man of integrity. The Ridge Historical Society followed suit, highlighting the lodge as a cultural landmark. Even the local honey co-op praised my sustainable farming methods. The bitter taste of isolation began to fade, replaced by the warmth of real community support. But Beatrice wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. Her next move was as simple as it was diabolical, and it would lead directly to the moment my door came flying off its hinges. Beatrice somehow managed to manipulate the Regional Power Authority into investigating grid irregularities coming from my orchard. For 3 days, they cut my service while they reviewed my solar-wind hybrid connection for safety violations. I was living by candlelight, like it was 1800, while she sat in her air-conditioned Range Rover at the end of my drive, watching me. Then came the bogus police reports. Reports of suspicious activity at my lodge in the middle of the afternoon. Loud disturbances suggesting domestic violence when I was the only soul on the property. Even claims of clandestine laboratory activity, because of the unusual number of visitors. I had visitors who were actually my old union brothers stopping by to bring me bags of ice and moral support. Each call brought Officer Miller, Beatrice's cousin, back to my door. Each visit generated another official incident report, and each report was a fresh brick in the wall she was building to bury me. During one particularly surreal encounter, Miller didn't even bother to get his notepad out. He just leaned against his cruiser and said, "You know, Silas, if you'd just sign the heritage agreement and apologize to Beatrice for your aggressive tone, all these technicalities would probably just evaporate." That was the moment I realized I wasn't just fighting for my trees. Beatrice was using me as a public execution to show the other landowners what happened when you didn't bend the knee. The families who had already sold the Millers and the Wilsons, they'd probably been drowned in this same sea of manufactured chaos until they just couldn't breathe anymore. The constant ping of my phone became a source of pure dread. Every notification was a potential new lie, another neighbor turning their back, or another escalation in Beatrice's psychological warfare. But it also brought a few flickers of light messages from old-timers who knew the Thorne name stood for something. The game was rigged, but I was finally starting to see where the wires were hidden. The breakthrough happened during the most tedious task imaginable, organizing my records for a sit-down with the regional director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. My friend Julian had set the whole thing up, explaining that the feds were looking into development racketeering across the state. I was sitting at my grandfather's heavy oak desk, surrounded by mountains of citations and legal threats, when a tiny detail on a council notice caught my eye. At the very bottom of one of Beatrice's violation letters, there was a footer I'd overlooked 10 times before. Fines payable to the High Crest Ridge Preservation Fund, account number 749201. Preservation Fund. It sounded noble, but after 30 years of inspecting corporate contracts, I knew that noble was often a mask for profitable. I made my fourth trip back to the county records office. Mrs. Gable saw me coming and already had the keys to the financial archive in her hand. "You're looking for the council's tax filings, aren't you, Silas?" she asked, her voice hushed. She spread the public records across the counter like a map to a buried treasure. The math didn't just not add up, it was a mathematical train wreck. Over the last 2 years, the Ridge Council had collected $280,000 in emergency assessments for ridge slope stabilization that had never actually been performed. Another $150,000 had been paid out for professional arboriculture services to a company called Sterling Greenery. According to the state's business registry, Sterling Greenery was incorporated exactly 3 weeks after Beatrice was appointed council president. The owner? Her brother-in-law. But the most blatant theft was the insurance claims. The council had filed for catastrophic wind damage reimbursement 3 times in the last 18 months. I had lived on this ridge through every one of those catastrophes, and there hadn't been enough wind to knock a ripe apple off a branch, let alone justify $95,000 in payouts. Mrs. Gable helped me cross-reference the claims with the official logs from the National Weather Service. The council was claiming storm destruction on days when the sky had been a cloudless blue. "Silas," Mrs. Gable whispered, glancing toward the door. "This isn't a zoning dispute. This is professional-grade fraud. They're looting the community." My hands were steady, but my heart was hammering against my ribs as I photocopied every page. These weren't just papers, they were the nails for Beatrice's legal coffin. This was a systematic operation to rob every resident on the ridge. The final piece of the puzzle was the administrative fee. The council was paying $5,000 every month to an entity called High Crest Management Solutions for consulting. I looked up the business address. It was a private P.O. box located in the same zip code as Beatrice's primary residence in the city. It all clicked. The harassment wasn't just about her ego or her vision. She was intentionally driving property values into the dirt to clear the way for a massive luxury development project while simultaneously draining the current residents' bank accounts through a slush fund. The families who had already sold their land for pennies hadn't just been bullied, they'd been defrauded. They'd been told their land was worthless by the very people who were secretly planning to turn it into a $10 million resort. I thought about the old couples who had spent their lives on this mountain, only to be chased away by a criminal in a designer suit. The taste of my morning coffee had never been so bitter. Beatrice wasn't just a neighbor from hell, she was the CEO of a criminal enterprise. That night, I turned my grandfather's back bedroom into a war room. I pinned maps of the ridge to the walls, marking the original boundaries versus the council's new easements. I created a timeline that tracked every one of Beatrice's harassment tactics alongside her secret financial transactions. I had photos, recordings, and enough documentation to fill a courtroom. I felt like a man bracing for a storm, but for the first time in 6 months, I wasn't afraid. I was the one holding the lightning. I was ready for the most important meeting of my life, and I knew exactly what would happen when Beatrice inevitably tried to break down my door to stop me. The state prosecutor's office assigned 2 specialists to my case, Elena Moretti and Liam Foster. They arrived the following morning looking like they were ready to dismantle a cartel. Elena was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who reminded me of the no-nonsense safety inspectors I used to report to on the rigs. Liam was younger, perhaps in his early 30s, but he carried a quiet intensity that suggested he'd already put plenty of white-collar thieves behind bars. Mr. Thorne, Elena said, spreading the financial audits across my grandfather's dining table. What you've uncovered here goes far beyond a neighborhood squabble. This is a predatory, systematic fraud operation that has likely impacted dozens of families. Liam pulled out a tablet and started connecting dots I hadn't even noticed yet. We've been tracking similar patterns in 4 other mountain districts. The playbook is identical. Politically connected individuals use heritage or beautification councils to manipulate property values while funneling community funds into private pockets. That was when they dropped the real bombshell. The Federal Bureau of Investigation was already involved. Special Agent Sarah Vance, no relation to my lawyer, Julian, had been tracking development racketeering across the state. My paper trail was the missing link they needed to tie several ongoing investigations together. The beauty of financial crimes, Agent Vance told me during a secure video call, is that the numbers don't lie. Your council records show classic money laundering, ghost invoices, and blatant insurance fraud. But we need more than just paper. We need to catch the ringleader in the act of a felony. My lawyer, Julian, had been busy too. He'd reached out to 17 other families on the ridge who had been targeted. When we gathered them at the local Veterans Hall, their stories made my blood boil. The Bakers had paid $8,000 in manufactured fines before selling their home for 30% below market value. The Chen family had been hit with assessments totaling $12,000 for road improvements that were never paved. Old Mr. Harrison had been so intimidated by Beatrice's threats that he abandoned the cabin he'd lived in for 43 years to move into a tiny city apartment. Every story was the same: escalating harassment, fake violations, and a crushing pressure to sell. And every cent of those fines had gone into that preservation fund, Beatrice's personal piggy bank. A retired accountant named Frank, who lived a few miles down the ridge, volunteered to help us dissect the tax filings. Here's the thing, Silas, Frank explained, pointing to a ledger. Organizations like this are required to file a Form 1120 every year if they hit certain income levels. Legitimate boards file them religiously. Corrupt ones don't, because an honest tax return would be a confession of theft. Frank had discovered that Beatrice's counsel hadn't filed a proper tax return in over 2 years, despite collecting hundreds of thousands of dollars in fees. That single failure meant we could potentially trigger federal tax evasion charges on top of the racketeering. Our strategy session felt like planning a high-stakes military operation. We had the evidence, the witnesses, and the motive. But the authorities wanted something bigger. They wanted Beatrice to incriminate herself in real time. She needs to feel like she's losing control, Elena Moretti explained. When people like Beatrice feel their power slipping, they stop being careful. They get desperate. Julian suggested the perfect bait. The state attorney general had been looking for a location to announce a new Landowner Protection Act. What better place than the historic Thorne Orchard? It was symbolically perfect, protecting the rights of citizens in the very spot where they were being trampled. We spent the next week preparing what the FBI called a controlled confrontation. High-definition recording equipment was hidden throughout my lodge. Undercover agents were positioned in the tree line. The community coalition was ready to flood social media the moment we gave the word. I felt like I was back on the rigs, prepping for a high-pressure bypass. When the job is dangerous, you have backup plans for your backup plans. The trap was set. Beatrice's behavior was so predictable that we could practically script her next move. All we had to do was wait for her to snap. And snap she did. As the date of the Attorney General's visit approached, Beatrice's harassment shifted from bureaucratic to physical. It was like watching a cornered predator lash out. The first sign was my solar array. I woke up on a Tuesday morning to find my batteries dead and my inverter flashing error codes. When my friend Elias came by to inspect it, he found that several high-voltage lines had been professionally sabotaged, loosened just enough to cause a short circuit without starting an obvious fire. This wasn't an accident, Silas, Elias said, snapping photos of the damage. Someone knew exactly which wires to pull. But Elias had been one step ahead. He'd hidden a small, motion-activated camera inside the electrical housing. 2 nights later, we caught her. The footage was undeniable: Beatrice Sterling, the grand dame of the Ridge, creeping around my barn at 3 in the morning with a pair of insulated wire cutters. The faint scent of her expensive perfume was still lingering in the air when the sun came up. Next, she went after my grandfather's vintage tractor, a 1978 powerhouse that still ran like a watch. I came out one morning to find it rolling down the hill toward the ravine. The parking brake had been intentionally disengaged and the gear shift kicked into neutral. If it hadn't snagged on an old oak stump, it would have been a total loss. But her biggest mistake, the one that truly crossed the line, was the irrigation system. I just passed a state water inspection, but suddenly my lines began to back up, flooding the lower orchard with a foul, gray sludge. Someone had poured a massive amount of quick-setting industrial foam into my main drainage pipe. The stench was horrific, a chemical, sulfurous odor that made my eyes water from 50 feet away. It was a deliberate attempt to create an environmental hazard that would justify an emergency seizure of my land. She thought she was breaking me. She had no idea that every act of sabotage was being live-streamed directly to a federal server. She was digging her own grave, and she was doing it in designer heels. When the emergency remediation crew arrived, they found that an industrial-grade sulfuric acid had been poured directly into my drainage lines. It hadn't just clogged the pipes, it had wiped out the entire biological ecosystem of the system, turning my backyard into a toxic marsh. This wasn't some kid with a bottle of drain cleaner, Silas, the technician said, peering at his testing kit. Someone used high-concentration commercial agents. This stuff requires a specialized permit even to buy. It's calculated destruction. The bill for the emergency excavation and chemical neutralization came to $3,200. But more importantly, the chemical signatures provided a forensic footprint. This wasn't random vandalism, it was a professional-level hit on my infrastructure that required intimate knowledge of the property's layout. While I was standing in a literal mess, Beatrice was busy orchestrating a figurative one. Anonymous social media accounts began flooding every local community board with leaked reports of my ongoing environmental violations. The bots were so transparent it was almost funny: dozens of profiles with no photos and names like Ridge Watcher 84, posting identical scripts within 3 minutes of each other. She also tightened the noose around my daily life. Officer Miller's patrol presence went from concerning to harassment. He began cruising past the orchard 4 or 5 times every afternoon, slowing to a crawl. Sometimes he'd just sit at the edge of my gravel drive for 20 minutes, visibly running the plates of anyone who dared to visit me. Suddenly, my supporters were catching heat, too. Elias received a notice that his master electrician's license was being audited for historical safety compliance. Julian, my attorney friend, found himself facing a frivolous complaint with the state bar regarding unauthorized legal advice. Even the Mountain Veterans League was hit with a surprise fire safety inspection that threatened to shut down their kitchen right before their annual fundraiser. Beatrice was sending a clear message to the valley: stand with Silas, and you'll burn with him. The psychological weight was immense. Every morning I'd wake up expecting a new catastrophe, a new legal threat, a new emergency inspection, or another piece of my life being dismantled. The metallic tang of high-octane stress became my constant companion. But Beatrice's desperation was making her sloppy. Every escalation was being logged by the federal team, and every act of sabotage was another nail in her coffin. Agent Vance called it textbook criminal spiraling. When a predator feels the walls closing in, they stop acting strategically and start acting vengefully. Beatrice was walking straight into the center of a federal dragnet, one sabotaged wire at a time. Beatrice's final move was as bold as it was insane. Through her husband's connections at the state capitol, she'd figured out that my important visitor wasn't just a random bureaucrat. She knew the regional director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation was coming to my home. Instead of fleeing, she decided to flip the script. Her plan was brilliant in a twisted way. She would position herself as the victim of a high-level political conspiracy. She reached out to a fringe digital network called the Patriot Ledger, the kind of site that loves stories about big government overreach. Her narrative was perfect: local heritage leader persecuted by federal agents for her political beliefs. She painted me as a deep state operative who was using his friendship with prosecutors to silence a brave community advocate. 3 days before the meeting, the headlines started circulating online. The comment sections were a powder keg of people who had never even been to our mountain, all of them convinced that Beatrice was a martyr. But her master stroke was the live stream. She'd arranged to broadcast her planned confrontation with the FBI director live on social media, framing it as citizen journalism exposing corruption in real time. She intended to burst into my lodge during the meeting, record the clandestine gathering, and use the footage as proof of a government hit job. What she didn't realize was that we were monitoring her every digital footprint. Agent Vance had secured federal warrants for Beatrice's devices weeks ago. We knew about the blogger outreach, the live stream setup, and even the talking points she'd practiced in front of her mirror. "It's actually perfect," Agent Vance told me during our final briefing. "She's going to commit multiple felonies on a live video feed while providing us with a real-time confession of her motives. We couldn't have choreographed it better." The irony was delicious. Beatrice thought she was the one setting the trap, but she was actually walking into the most thoroughly documented arrest in the history of the county. Her support network was already turning to ash, though she was too obsessed to see it. The other members of the Heritage Council had quietly resigned once the financial irregularities surfaced. Her husband was under an internal ethics review and couldn't protect her anymore. Even her cousin, Officer Miller, had been reassigned to a different district after internal affairs started asking questions about his surveillance of my property. But Beatrice was beyond rational thought. The pressure of keeping her $5 million fraud scheme hidden had pushed her past the breaking point. She was exhibiting all the signs of a total breakdown, paranoid that her neighbors were spying on her, making threatening midnight phone calls to anyone who had supported me. The night before the director's visit, she made threatening calls to 4 different families, warning them of grave consequences if they continued to collaborate with the Thorne investigation. Each call was recorded. Each one was another charge of witness intimidation added to the file. I spent that final evening on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the peaks, painting the orchard in shades of deep violet and gold. The sound of the mountain wind through the trees reminded me why this dirt was worth the blood and the stress. Tomorrow would decide whether I'd get to live out my retirement in peace or if I'd spend my remaining years fighting off Beatrice's lawyers from a witness stand. The lodge felt different that night, not just because of the hidden cameras and high-tech microphones, but because it had become the front line for the soul of our community. I checked the heavy oak door one last time. I knew it wouldn't hold against a determined kick, but that was the point. I wanted her to break in. I wanted the world to see exactly who Beatrice Sterling really was. This wasn't just about my lodge or my apple trees anymore. This was a test to see if a small-time criminal with a director, title and high-level political cover could terrorize an entire mountain community without a single consequence. I pulled out my grandfather's old leather-bound journal and read the note he'd tucked into the back cover. Silas, a bully only wins as long as they believe you're more afraid of losing your things than you are of losing your soul. The morning would bring Beatrice's final, desperate gambit. She was going to storm through my front door thinking she was the hero of her own twisted movie, never realizing she was actually the star of a federal sting operation. The stage was set. The microphones were hot. The regional director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation was sipping coffee in my kitchen. All we had to do was wait for Beatrice to provide the grand finale to her own criminal career. Director Marcus Maxwell was nothing like the cinematic version of a federal agent. Instead of a stiff suit, he was a man in his 50s wearing a rugged flannel shirt that made him look like just another local. He had a calm, steady gaze that suggested he'd seen every trick in the book. He'd arrived at the orchard at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, carrying a heavy file filled with evidence that would change the history of the ridge forever. "Mr. Thorne," he said, leaning back in my grandfather's old oak chair. "Your documentation didn't just help us find the fraud. It exposed a network that spans 6 different counties. What you've done here is going to save a lot of families from losing their legacy." We were deep in the middle of discussing the specific wire fraud charges when we heard it. The distinctive, high-pitched roar of a Range Rover engine tearing up my gravel drive at a speed that was clearly meant to intimidate. Gravel sprayed against the side of the barn like birdshot. Car doors slammed with metallic finality. Beatrice had arrived, and she hadn't come alone. I could hear her shouting instructions to her production crew, the social media trolls she'd hired to film her victory. "Here we go," Agent Vance whispered into her earpiece from her concealed position in the pantry. Director Maxwell didn't even blink. He just casually flipped a page in his file while Beatrice's voice rose to a screech outside, performing for her digital audience. "This is it, everyone." Beatrice's voice echoed through the windows. "We are about to catch the corruption in the act. The federal government is illegally collaborating with a local menace to silence our heritage movement. I'm going in to expose the truth." The sound of her designer heels clicking aggressively across my porch was like a countdown. 5, 4, 3, 2. Crash. The heavy cedar door didn't just open, it exploded inward. Beatrice must have had one of her hired security guys put a shoulder to it, because the wood splintered and the hinges groaned in protest. A cloud of mountain dust and the sickeningly sweet scent of her perfume filled the room. Beatrice stormed into my living room, her phone held high like a torch, her face twisted in a mask of righteous fury for her 4,000 live viewers. She was completely oblivious to the fact that she had just committed felony breaking and entering and criminal trespass in front of the top federal investigator in the region. "I demand to know why federal agents are meeting in secret with this criminal," she shrieked, waving her phone toward Director Maxwell. "This is a political hit job. I have rights. I am the president of this council." The look on her face when Director Maxwell slowly stood up and placed his gold federal shield on the table was a masterpiece of pure, unadulterated shock. Beatrice's live stream captured the exact millisecond her brain stopped functioning. Her jaw didn't just drop, it seemed to hang by a thread. "Mrs. Sterling," Maxwell said in a voice so cold it could have frozen the orchard in mid-July. "I am Director Marcus Maxwell of the FBI. You have just committed multiple state and federal felonies in my presence, and your entire performance is currently being recorded by both the Department of Justice and your own digital followers. I suggest you stop talking." Beatrice's phone was still live. Her followers were watching in real time as their heroic leader, turned into a trembling, incoherent mess. The comments section on her screen was a blur of confusion as people realized they had been cheering for a woman who had just effectively talked herself into a prison cell. I was only, this is my jurisdiction, she stammered, still clutching her Heritage Council badge as if it were a magical amulet that could protect her from the law. That's when Agent Vance stepped out of the pantry, followed by 2 more agents in tactical vests. Beatrice Sterling, you are under arrest for racketeering, embezzlement, witness intimidation, and 10 counts of insurance fraud. And thanks to your live stream, we have your confession of intent broadcast to several thousand witnesses. The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut was the most beautiful music I'd heard in 30 years. Beatrice's phone clattered to the floor, the screen still showing a live feed of her being led out of the lodge she'd called an eyesore. Beatrice, I said, standing up with a quiet, satisfied smile. Meet the FBI. I think they'd like to see your bookkeeping for the preservation fund. The neighbors who had been drawn by the noise stood on the edge of the drive in stunned silence. They watched as the woman who had terrorized High Crest Ridge was read her rights in the shadow of the very trees she'd tried to steal. The silver Range Rover, with its number 1 vanity plates, was hooked up to a tow truck to be seized as an asset in the fraud case. The live stream finally cut out with the sound of Beatrice's voice echoing down the valley, my husband will stop this. You don't know who you're dealing with. Actually, we knew exactly who we were dealing with. A common thief. And thieves go to prison. Watching Beatrice get sentenced 4 months later was the highlight of my retirement. The federal judge didn't show an ounce of mercy. She was handed 4 years in a federal facility, ordered to pay $420,000 in restitution to the families she'd defrauded, and received a permanent ban from ever serving on a community board again. Her husband, Arthur, fared no better. The ethics investigation into his office revealed he'd been using state resources to facilitate the land grab scheme. He resigned in total disgrace and was sentenced to 2 years for conspiracy. The Ridge Heritage Council was dissolved within 48 hours. In its place, we formed the High Crest Growers Collective. There are no mandatory fees, no aesthetic fines, and no dictators in designer wraps. We're just neighbors who help each other pick apples and keep the mountain roads clear. My role in the investigation earned me a whistleblower reward from the recovered funds. That check for $55,000 paid for a brand new roof and a top-of-the-line security system, not that I think I'll need it. But the real reward was the peace. Last night, I sat on the porch and watched the hawks circle the valley. The lodge was quiet, the air was clean, and the only thing clicking on my property was the sound of the wind through the leaves. My grandfather was right, the land picks you. And I think, after everything we went through, the land is finally happy. The legal victory wasn't just a win for my orchard, it was the spark that ignited a statewide movement. The Thorne Act was officially signed into law 3 months later, requiring every homeowner's council to undergo an independent financial audit every 12 months and establishing severe criminal penalties for harassment-based land manipulation. Our evidence helped the state prosecute similar fraud rings in 3 other counties. As it turned out, Beatrice's operation was just one branch of a much larger network of politically connected criminals who had been systematically robbing families across rural communities for over a decade. The final report from the Federal Bureau identified over 24 related cases spanning 5 different states. The families who had been bullied off the ridge started coming back, too. The Wilsons bought a beautiful new plot just 2 doors down from mine after the fraudulent terms of their original sale were legally voided. Mr. Harrison moved back from his cramped city apartment and threw a homecoming block party that lasted until the sun crested over the peaks. Property values didn't just recover, they soared. Turns out, when you remove the constant threat of manufactured citations and predatory fines, people actually want to live in a peaceful mountain community. Who would have thought? The transformation went far beyond the courtroom. Our little ridge became a national model for sustainable community living. My off-grid lodge, which Beatrice once targeted as an unsightly hazard, now hosts monthly tours for university students and engineers interested in solar-wind hybrid systems and environmental stewardship. The state's Renewable Energy Agency even featured the orchard in their annual showcase program. I established the Thorne Legacy Scholarship using a portion of my whistleblower compensation. We provide $500 grants to local kids entering trade school programs. My grandfather always believed that knowing how to build something with your own hands was the foundation of an honest life, and it felt right to help the next generation learn those same values. The annual High Crest Harvest Festival has become a major regional attraction, raising money for veterans' housing assistance. Last year, we brought in enough to fund 3 tiny home projects for homeless veterans in the valley. The sweet smell of wood smoke and the sound of families laughing has permanently replaced the toxic atmosphere Beatrice tried to cultivate. But the best part is the quiet. I'm sitting on the porch right now, watching the sunset paint the ridges in shades of deep gold and violet. The hawks are circling high above the valley, their cries echoing off the same cliffs where my grandfather taught me how to graft apple trees 50 years ago. My solar panels hum peacefully on the barn roof, powering a life that is finally my own again. There are no more certified letters. No more emergency inspections. No more designer heels clicking across my gravel at dawn. There is only the gentle rustle of the leaves and the knowledge that if you are stubborn enough and your cause is righteous enough, the little guy really can take down a giant. A production crew from a major streaming service finished filming here last month. A documentary titled Ridge War, The Man Who Cracked the Council is set to premiere next spring. They paid me enough to build a guest cabin on the lower Loda place where other victims of property harassment can stay while they gather the evidence to fight their own battles. Because Beatrice Sterling wasn't unique. There are power-drunk dictators in communities all across the country, terrorizing homeowners and treating community funds like their personal ATM. But now, there's a roadmap for fighting back. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever dealt with a neighborhood queen or a corrupt board? Drop a comment below and share your own story. Trust me, you are not alone in this fight, and these stories need to be heard. Hit that subscribe button if you want more stories about everyday people taking down corrupt systems, because I've got plenty more to tell.